I guess we should get back to plants. There's a picture early on which is this big vortex picture. That one there you've got, that one there. So this picture here is quite an interesting and important picture. And it was the first really one I did because it's about looking at the layers of the spirit and the astral and the etheric and the physical and in one sort of vortex. And so I've just put all the different information on there. And one of the things that happens in biodynamics is that we've got a big subject here and we've got lots of weird concepts. And what tends to happen is people start to have these conversations, but they don't go anywhere. They sort of just fizzle out because it's hard to sort of nail a lot of this stuff down. And so that's where I find this picture, really valuable. And one of the things that I've done, of course, is that I've put the biodynamic preparations in here. So, as a sort of basis of your thoughts, along the way, you get led to a particular preparation. And so it's giving you a solution. So using this picture, you're able to sort of follow the thoughts and come to a conclusion. And that's really quite valuable. It was interesting, Shane commented that that's what it's done for him, is that it's allowed him to sort of feel that he can come to some conclusion. And so that's all very well, that we've got this vortex, but a vortex doesn't exist by itself. It actually is part of a circle. It's part of the vertical axis of the circle. So we have to get all this information and expand it out to the gyroscope, basically. And so that's what this picture is. It's actually telling us, here's the spirit, here's the astral, this is etheric, this is physical, this is outside us, polarity, and there's the earth. And so when we look at that picture, which we'll come back to in a minute, we're looking at the earthly forces, earthly substance, cosmic substance, earthly substance here. So this is the circle we're working on, okay? So we're coming right down to the energies that are just behind matter. And we've talked a bit about them already, but that's where we're sort of heading at this particular moment. Right. And so this picture here is in the eighth lecture. And the 8th lecture is about animals and how to feed animals and so on.
Page 27.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, I've got 31 there, but anyway. What's page 31? Anyway, so what we've got here is this threefold process. There's the nerve sense is down the bottom, and we have the metabolic at the top. And so this is a bit of an expanded vision of this. But the main point is just where are we in the game? That's the sort of point I'm trying to point out here. And so we're right in the physical body, just behind manifest, So these are forces that are literally pushing around matter. And as I said, what Steiner said was we can use clay, lime, sand, humus. So he's saying we actually have physical levers to push these four things around. And so that's why it's valuable, because we've got a lever. And I was showing before how we can push this up with clay, we can push this back down with sand. The lime will help to bulk things out and give us structural integrity in the plant's cell structure. And then we've got this humus-based etheric forces which makes things bigger. So what we've got is sort of upward structure going off to seed. We've got cellular, what would you call it, integrity. We've got size, and we've got ripening. We've got quality coming in with the light and the warmth from above. And so these are these 4 parts of plant growth we can control with these 4 things that Steiner's suggested. So it's quite valuable. And so that same picture, this is in the 8th lecture as well. So that was that one I was looking for before, this astral and the spirit underneath. And this comes out of another lecture series, which is that sap story, when I talked of wood sap and life sap and cambium. This is the story that he gives. And so these yellow bits here, they're the same as this spirit here. And these are this accumulation of spirit that happens in the earth. And he calls it ego potentiality at a certain point. And so in this story, what he's talking about is that we've got to get this wood sap process coming up, and we've got to get the light and the water processes coming into the plant, and we've got to get that spinning. That's what this spinningness is here. And he says we've got to get this intensity of spin up so that we can suck in the heat. We can suck in that warmth. And this is this purple, which he calls cambium. And so, and this cambium is the translocation of all the, honey and bread from up top here that's created by the photosynthesis into the roots. And so this is where he's talking about that translocation back into the roots here. But that's that picture that we've really got to get the dynamic intensity of the plant up. We could say we've got to get the vibration of the plants up. And this is what the preparations are doing. They're actually, we're stimulating the bottom and we're compressing the top so that we're sort of getting this thing more intense. And, this is what you feel usually when you can go onto a biodynamic property. And yes, there's a sort of a calm, but there's this sort of bit of an intensity of life that's going on there. And it was quite funny one day. We have a preparation we call the Etherics 1000, which is all of the preparations. Soil activator, I think you have in use in Australia, that's very similar. And one of my clients one day, he said, I sprayed that stuff and I walked out into my garden and the plants were just jumping out at me. So this is the intensity that we need. So they're just those images there that, to get that, we need to build that compression between that sort of upward thrust and the downward movement to build that intensity, So that's a good image that I found interesting. This is coming out of the medical lectures. And this is what I was talking about before, that this is quite a common understanding in Hinduism as well as in Steiner's story, that the plant is really the upturned human, and that the roots are in this nerve sense system, this metabolic, and at the top here. Now, what he's pointing out in this picture is that this is actually inverted. This is the head region up here, because this is for people and it's coming from Koenig. And so, but there's this interplay here where the nerve sense system works into the metabolic system, and the metabolic system works into the nerve sense system. So when we were looking at that picture a minute ago, the one in front of you now, it's this question of how did the astral activity get into the metabolic system? Because in a sense, the spirit and the astral sort of live in the nerve sense system, and the etheric and the physical primarily live here. So we sort of have this process, the expanding out of the earth and the cosmic contraction. So what's happened? And so in this sort of development of our bodies and so on, this astral activity, which is a nerve sense activity, has migrated into the metabolic system. And that this metabolic process that he's calling physical has migrated into our head. And so he gives this story that when we eat something, we take it into our digestion, and in our stomach we've got acid. The only place we find chlorine is in our stomach, as hydrochloric acid. And that acid sort of burns whatever we've got. And so what is coming, we're bringing in all these etheric and astral forces, and they come into our body, and in that sort of digestion, let's call it dissolving process in our stomach, we have to use our forces to overcome those world forces. And if we can't overcome them, then they're poison. Those world forces stay as world forces, and they then act as a poison within our body because we can't digest them. So we've got to have enough sort of strength here to be able to dissolve and destroy that. Now in that destruction, we have this ash he talks about, that we're ashing this substance, and that this ash actually works its way up into our brain and acts as the substance of our brain. So it's this calcium-based process that comes to form the substance of our brain, and the substance of our brain then acts like a satellite dish to receive the cosmic forces from outside. So there's all this stuff going on, and we're just receiving it. Now in our daily life, we just think they're random thoughts that are running around, and we just sort of let it all happen and we don't do anything with it. But they're indeed these sort of cosmic forces, and the quality of the brain is determined by the quality of our digestion. So this is this gut-brain thing that everybody talks about now. And so there's a little bit of a joke here that so we get the ashing taking place, that takes out these, what do we call them, the earthly substance, and that ash works up to our brain. And I was at a anthroposophical doctors conference, and they talked about the actual pathways that this took place. They actually showed the physical way this occurred. I can't repeat it, but it was good. Okay, then the etheric part of the food we take is liberated, and this, in a sense, gives us these life forces that we can then sort of move around with, and the excrement is then passed out. So what we can't digest or whatever, out it goes. Now, from the other direction, we're getting all of these cosmic forces that are being received by our brain, which in a sense then leads to our senses, our taste, our smell, our eyes, our skin. And so we have an input through our senses. And this is what he calls the cosmic substance. And that this input of senses, in a sense, then works all the way down into our metabolism and works with these earthly forces. So this is where the etheric and the astral then start working in the metabolism. And he makes this comment that it's these forces coming this way that leads a pig to become fat. So he makes this comment that a pig is just a sack of cosmic substance. Yeah. And so, it sort of says, well, weight to some degree is unresolved, undigested sense impressions, if that makes sense. That if there's all this stuff coming in and you're not really digesting it, it just bulks on. And so we've got this process, but what what it sort of means is that we've got a nerve sense process in the metabolic, and we've got a metabolic process in the nerve sense. And they work together. And so coming back to my joke, that, you know, if our digestion is not strong enough, then this ashing process is relatively incomplete. And so sort of excrement, what goes out as excrement, goes up to our brains, and so we have shit for brains. But the real picture I like is that our brain is really just this collector of impressions from outside. It's just this satellite dish, and it's about whether we can pick that up and bring it to consciousness or not, really. But he's talking, you know, in the nerve sense, we've got a expansive and a contractive process taking place here, and we've got an expansive and a contractive process taking place here. And I've characterised that in this picture. So this is where, you know, we've got those four bodies, and so what we've got here is a primary in the nerve sense system. We've got a primary, page 36. We've got a primary contractive process taking place in the nerve sense system, and a primary sort of expansive process taking place in the metabolic system. But we also, you know, have the opposite. And so it's this interplay. Now, the nerve sense system is a sort of contractive process, the metabolic being expansive, and they call it anabolic and catabolic. Now, anabolic is the building up process, and catabolic is the breaking down process. So the nerve sense process is a breaking down process. This is an upbuilding process. Now, he then characterises this contracting process as a hardening. It tends to harden and deadenify things, so it's a sclerotic process. You know, it sort of leads to sclerosis. Whereas the other, coming this way, is an inflammation process. And so if we've got an overly active sort of process in our belly, pushing up into our heads, then we get migraines, because there's this sort of pushing out. And so the solution to that is to push all that back down. And he gives this remedy called BDOR, which is silica and iron sulfate that he sort of cooks together. And the silica pushes down, the iron somehow stimulates this metabolic process, and the sulfur harmonises these two activities. But the process he's looking at is just pushing the metabolic back down into the belly. Yeah.
And what did you call it?
BDOR, B-I-D-O-R. And you know, and the alternative happens as well, that as this sclerosis comes down, then everything starts to slow down and become sluggish, and you start getting depositing problems, you know, and you know, swelling ankles and you know, everything's just getting stodgy. So this is that sort of interplay that's sort of taking place, but you know, we've got this duality occurring here, where you know, we need to have this astral process coming in to keep the etheric moving, because as I said, water left to itself will become stagnant. It needs some outside force to keep it active. And so this is actually the picture of equisetum, that what I did a study on this, because Steiner in the course said, if we look at the activity of equisetum on the kidney in the human, we'll understand the process. And then off he went. And it was like, oh, yeah, righty-o. And I've got to say, I haven't really found a book to talk about that. Man and Earth by Carl Koenig addresses this to some degree. So I did a study of this through the medical lectures, and it's in that book, 5 essays or 5 questions. And so what's happening is that the kidneys are an astral processor, is the best way to put it. That they're getting the blood and they're seeing what's out of balance. And so they're stripping out excess nitrogen, they're stripping out, excess salinity and sort of pH and all these things. They're balancing the blood as best it can. So it's processing the astral body. Now, if you've got too much world astral going on and your kidneys can't process that, then they shrink. And so what he's saying is that if you've got too much world astral, then it actually pushes out the internal astral, and the etheric, the internal etheric, then becomes sluggish, and that means that the kidneys shrink. So the solution to that is that we've got to bring in this internal astral again to push out the world astral, pick up the etheric and get it working. And he's saying this is what equisetum does, and sort of gives the whole story about the silica process in the equisetum. Equisetum is a plant that existed before the differentiation of plants developed. It was, so it's really just a stem, as it were. And so and anyway, its main job is this stimulation of this astral activity to pick up the etheric, get it working, and get that sort of pulse going and stimulate this metabolic process to push back against the nerve sense process. Now, we noticed in that story about fungus, all that water coming out of the earth, and he's getting the metabolic silica, pushing it back. Okay, same story. That's exactly what's happening. So, but when we go into the medical lectures, we get that it's actually stimulating the internal astral. It's actually the spirit that's stimulating the astral to stimulate the etheric, is what's going on. But that's ultimately it. Now, we might as well just have a look at cowhorns in this moment. Now, this is quite a sort of a long-standing, unclear story in biodynamics. And we've just been talking about this process going on here between the etheric and the astral. And in the head here, we've got this process of the spirit and the physical taking place. Now, it's in the 4th lecture, I believe, and Steiner starts talking about how the etheric and the astral are functioning in the metabolic system. And it can be a bit confusing because, as I said before, at one level, the astral and the spirit are functioning in the nerve sense, and the physical and the etheric are working from the earth. And so this conversation could mean that this astral and this etheric are working like that. It could mean that. I don't believe it does. I believe we're talking this way, as indicated. And so what he's saying is that with the cowhorn, what we have is that this astral and etheric activity that's maintaining the metabolic system is working forwards towards the nerve sense system, as is normal. And the cowhorn, which, we know is like this cowhorn receives these metabolic processes and is reflected back into the metabolic system. and that this is the way the cow maintains these four stomachs. You know, it's this huge metabolic being, and the only way that that metabolism can be maintained is if that activity is, in a sense, kept in the cow. And so he says the cow horn cuts off these streams of activity to the outside. And then he says, but in the case of the stag, with the antlers, you know, with all the branching and so on, the cow horn, this outer sort of sheath of the cow horn is keratin substance, which is quite hard, whereas in the stag's horn, that becomes the velvet. So it's a much sort of more hair-like substance. But what he says with the stag is that these forces come out through the antlers and extend out into the atmosphere a certain distance, and that gives the stag this jittery psychic sensitivity to the environment. And so this is the polarity that he's painting, that we've got one situation where these forces are held back, and we've got another situation where they stream forward. And you know, it's an interesting part of intuition. You feel it in your gut is the colloquial term. I feel it in my stomach, you know. And it's this sort of, you feel it deeply. And so, you know, this is the story, that we have this horn that has the ability to contain and reflect back whatever goes in. And so this is why he uses horns for preparations. You put manure in there and it acts as a collector of winter forces, into this metabolic substance. And as I said before, what we're doing with these preparations is the 500 is a metabolic substance that we're putting into a winter earth. So that's this nerve sense period of the earth. And so he's bringing a metabolic process into the soil. And so this is where it's proliferating into soil biology and soil quality and all that sort of stuff. And it makes plants big. You know, it'll stop cabbages going off to head. One time we did this, and I think we were using a bit of chamomile as well. And we had leaves, you know, like this big. And then we better spray it with some 501, which we did. And then, of course, the cabbage was about that big when it sort of all headed up, you know, after the 501. So this is this metabolic process that's sort of been brought into the earth. And similarly, the silica, we're using this earth substance into the metabolic. And so this is allowing that structuring force to now come into this sort of chaotic environment. So it helps bring quality and refinement into crops. So it's an interesting thing about, you know, the opposite into, you know. Okay, and so, this is an important story. And of course, some people say the cow horns act as these astral receivers, because, you know, the front of the cow, this is where he gives this story of the cow, the sun. He draws the sun there and the moon there, and he sort of does that sort of image. So the sun processes and the outer planets are coming from the front of the cow, and the inner planets processes are coming from the back of the cow. And now, what's my point? So therefore, there's a spirit and an astral sort of process here, and that the horns is drawing in this astral process, and that is what's being collected in the 500, is this astral stimulant.
And is it a cow horn, that 500 then?
No, the cow horn is the container.
Oh yeah, but you put the 500 in it.
You put the manure into the cow horn,
Yeah.
and that becomes 500,
Yeah.
or you put ground up silica,
Yeah.
and that becomes 501. But in both cases, the cow horn is being treated as this container.
Yeah.
And so we've got one, that in comes the forces and they're held, and the other is saying that the cow horn is bringing the forces in from the outside. You see? So these are these two different stories. But he says, I believe it's in the 4th lecture, he points out when he says the horn is cutting off these forces from going out of the cow, he says the hair and skin are what bring in the astral. So our hair here and our hair here, that's what's bringing these astral streams into our body, and it's the cow horn that sort of cuts off this metabolic process that's coming from the back. So, the Europeans accept the story I'm telling you. In America, you tend to get this other story a wee bit. Dennis Klochek, in his book Sacred Agriculture, says this, which I personally don't agree with. So that's what we're doing with those two preparations, basically. And so this is the sort of picture that, in a way, we're working with in biodynamics, that we've got these sort of body activities, but within them, we've got this sort of inner polarity sort of taking place. So it's at a subtler level, but it's this inner workings that he talks about. So, while we're going past here, so this picture here is just a sort of clarification that we have these two processes, this calcium process and a silica process. And we can see that in our bones and in a plant. The silica builds the structure like a honeycomb, and the calcium puts the substance onto that structure, is the basic sort of picture that we've got. But it's quite important that we see that both of these cycles are circular, because this is another one of these odd, unresolved stories. Which way is this working? When you're just working with a polarity, silica goes this way, calcium goes this way. So when you've got the silica coming this way, that disturbs that story. And so people sort of go, well, don't understand this, it's a contradiction. But the way to understand it is that the silica processes are circular. They're coming out of the earth and being brought back down again. And there's this wonderful image of the calcium processes. Callum Coates did a book, Living Water. Yep. And in there, he tells this story about how plants draw in all these elements, cations and anions, and as it moves through the veins in the plant, or the capillaries in the plant, they get smaller and smaller, the capillaries. And so the water is spinning up these capillaries, and the substance gets locked into the plant, and the water gets puffed out through transpiration into the atmosphere, and of course that then comes back down to the earth as dew. And the plants can breathe that back in as well. And one of the interesting things about your tropical plants, because the soil is washed out by all the rain, you accept quite clearly that these plants are feeding off the atmospheric moisture, right? You sort of get that. Now in New Zealand, so your avocados are being fed by the atmosphere, and we take them to New Zealand and we start feeding the soil. And then they go, gee, we can't get the boron in. We can't get anything into these things because, it's all happening in the atmosphere. It's like the big belly of a tropical forest. And the roots are really just supplying some water and stability. But the main nutrition is coming through this atmosphere. And so this is where we're getting this calcium process. And so these elements are being potentized by these plants, is how Callum Coates puts it. So we're getting what Steiner called homeopathic calcium in and around the plants. And he says how this homeopathic calcium can then be sort of drawn back into the plants, and that this helps to feed the plants and bring bulk. And so we can see this sort of cycling of the calcium through the plant into the dew, back down in, and so on. And the same with silica. You've got to be able to see how that is rising out of the plant as silicic acid. And this is one of the interesting things about 501. Silica as a crystal is incredibly inert. It's not available very easily. And that's why we need boron and aluminium and nitrogen to dissolve the silica. And then that silica joins with water, because you've got, it's fairly simple chemistry. You've got silica oxide, and you put H2O, and you get H2S1, is it O4 or O2? O2, let's say. And so this is silicic acid. So it's once you can get the silica mobile, all you need is water to make the silicic acid, which then moves through the plant, carries up all the other nutrition. And I understand it's sort of most dense at the top of the plant. And so we, have this silica process where goes up through the plant, and of course the plant will die off and this will all come back down. But it will also, I would imagine, be translocated through the cambium back into the soil, as part of that soil nutrition that's going on. So the main thing is to see these two things as cyclic. They're circular, and they just keep rumbling along.
Just picked up within that, Glenn, with broad-scale tree clearing.
Yes.
We certainly lose a mineral cycle, which
yes.
is typical. Plants bring nutrients up and down deeply.
Yes.
Recycling that way. But from what you've just said, we've also lost another mineral cycle with the calcium, the dew, and all that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Obviously, something's happening in the grasslands, but not to the same extent. Yeah.
And when we get, say, broad-scale clearing, overgrazing, we don't get that dew fall.
Right.
So we're also losing.
Yep. And there's also that whole shading, cooling, burning out the organic matter, blah, blah, most definitely. That compounds all upon itself.
You're talking about the importance of water in there, and it's sort of easy to think that it is all tropical up here, but we have, at Mount Morgan, we got 6 months of basically arid climate, so we don't have that process, so we've got to do a lot of watering.
Right.
So does that impact where and how, like how often you water and when you water?
Well, yeah, for sure. Yeah, for sure. Most definitely. Yeah, most definitely. There is this work, and permaculture, I guess, promotes, a 30% tree, habitation within a landscape, and that will actually produce more than a no tree landscape, you know, so that's creating the shading and keeping the moisture. And this, Peter Backus pointed out to me one time, plants give off carbon dioxide, they give off oxygen. Now, carbon dioxide is heavier than air, and so carbon dioxide will accumulate closer to the earth, and where you have shelter belts and trees and stuff, then the carbon dioxide can actually build up, and that helps feed the plants. Whereas you've got an open landscape, the carbon dioxide is actually being blown away all the time. And so this is one of your benefits of having, you know, a stable environment. So yeah, there's lots of that.
I've noticed, like this last 4 mornings we've had frost up at our place, and the neighbours' places are sort of just mown grass, and we've got quite a decent tree cover now, and the neighbours' places were the colour of this.
Yeah.
And our place, we had little sort of patches of it here and there that you really see the difference in how it was behaving because of the microclimates from the trees.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
The trees themselves, like,
Okay.